Greetings to all of you at the NewSpace Africa Conference. My name is Peter Martinez and I'm the Executive Director of the Secure World Foundation. We are a private operating foundation that develops and promotes ideas and actions to achieve the secure, sustainable and peaceful uses of outer space, benefiting Earth and all of its peoples. We're based in the United States, but our activities have a very wide international footprint. We work with governments, industry, international organizations, and civil society in support of this objective, and I'm very pleased to represent our organization here today. I would like to thank the organizers for their kind invitation to deliver a keynote speech at this maiden NewSpace Africa Conference. I would have liked to do so in person, but my other commitments did not permit me to travel to today's event to deliver these remarks in person, so I appreciate the opportunity to do so via this recording. The theme of this conference is Making Africa the New Hotspot for Space Business. I would like to approach this theme from the perspective of the governance and regulation of space activities to talk about the cross-cutting issues that should be kept in mind in the development of the African space arena and what types of national and regional policies would enhance the growth and adoption of space technologies for Africa's development. When we find ourselves in unfamiliar territory, we often resort to using a map. Maps are depictions of the world around us, and they depict things that the map makers consider interesting and important. In other words, maps express a certain worldview and knowledge of the world. Take, for example, this map. This is the Hereford Mappa Mundi, a medieval map of the entire world as it was known to the map makers that produced it around the year 1300. It is displayed at the Hereford Cathedral in Hereford, England. The map may not look anything like a map of the world today. So to help you out, here is an overlay that shows the modern countries superimposed on this map. What you will notice is that the sizes of the countries depict their importance to these medieval map makers. On this map, only the African countries along the Mediterranean feature. The rest of the continent, which is vastly greater than the central areas of this map, were relegated to the periphery. The map depicts the locations of actual cities, biblical and mythical events, and shows the history, geography, and destiny of humanity as it was understood in Christian Europe in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. To make up for their lack of knowledge of remote, unexplored regions, cartographers relied on scant information gleaned from explorers or made up general depictions of imagined features or hazards. Policy development has some similarities to map making in the sense that a policy is a guide that we use to achieve certain objectives, but the guiding value of the map is only as good as the knowledge that underlies it, what in policy speak we call evidence-based policy making. It turns out that there is still a lot of educated guesswork and preconceived ideas in policy formulation, and we need to be mindful of this. I want to talk about a few of these features and pitfalls. But before starting with the policy process issues, let's review our knowledge of the known space world today to identify some of the cross-cutting issues that we will have to take into consideration. As we all know, the space arena is in a stage of rapid transformation. I want to focus on these developments from an African perspective. To start with, the space arena is becoming much more global today than it was 20 years ago. The map on the left depicts, in orange, the space powers at the beginning of the space age, and as you can see, the map is dominated by the two Cold War superpowers and a few of their allies. No African countries featured at that time. Fast forward to 2020, and you can see that there are now many more countries actively using space, and the map shows quite a number of African space nations. Since this map was drawn in 2020, a few more African countries have joined the Space Club. Now, this increase in activity has resulted in a significant increase in the population of space objects, both functional and non-functional. At the start of the space age, there was no space debris of anthropogenic origin, only natural meteoroid hazards. But 60 years of human space activities have generated vast amounts of debris that now vastly outnumber the active satellites and pose a risk to the safety of space operations. This is not just a challenge for the leading space nations. This has real policy and regulatory implications for African governments and real cost implications for African space actors. The number of new satellites that are being introduced into the space environment is growing exponentially. This chart shows the growth in the number of active satellites per year from 1957 to 2020, shown by different types of civilian and military space actors depicted in different colors. The yellow band shows the commercial sector that emerged in the 1980s and has grown very quickly over the past few years. As of today, there are around 5,000 active satellites in space. Taken together with a large debris population I referred to earlier, managing the space operations is going to need the development of an international space traffic management framework, and African countries need to be engaged in these processes. The last class of developments that I want to refer to is the emergence of new kinds of space activities, particularly driven by the commercial sector, that were not even envisaged when the existing international legal framework was developed in the 1960s. These include close proximity operations in orbit, such as on-orbit servicing, refueling, relocation, and active debris removal. These are all capabilities that underpin a future space economy, but they also raise concerns about their potential for military uses to attack space systems. Moreover, as more countries become critically reliant on space systems for their national security and defense, we are witnessing a worrying proliferation of counter-space capabilities that, when tested in orbit, could generate huge amounts of additional space debris, raising debris avoidance costs and collisional risks for all other space actors. These concerns affect African space operators as well, who may not be able to afford resilience through redundancy of satellites. There is a growing appetite in the international community for some sort of moratorium or ban on destructive anti-satellite weapons tests in orbit. African countries and the region collectively should add its voice in these multilateral debates. The last category of new developments has to do with the extraction, use, and ownership of space resources on the Moon and other celestial bodies. Granted, this is not a focus for African countries' space activities at the moment, but the legal regime for space resource utilization is currently being developed, and it would be good for African countries to engage in these debates to be part of the normative framework under which they will have to operate in future. With that scene set, let us now move to some of the policy considerations. The first point I want to make is that space policy is never primary policy. It's always ancillary policy in support of other primary policy objectives such as health, education, defense, etc. This is an important distinction because it means that space should be approached as a whole of government exercise, where space applications support multiple government departments and agencies in the attainment of their developmental goals. So, in particular, one can tie space capabilities very directly to the attainment of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. The United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs has done an analysis of the space contribution to each of the 17 SDGs, which is available on their website, and provides interesting ideas for commercial space actors looking to develop space applications in support of the SDGs in Africa. Each group of actors, from government, defense, academia, and industry, approach this issue from different and sometimes divergent interests and policy priorities. Established actors may have an interest to maintain the status quo. Others will seek to increase their influence and access to resources. To achieve convergence of space activities with national priorities, it makes sense to involve a range of actors from government, industry, defense, and academia to form policy logic coalitions among all of these actors. The second point is that policy development does not happen in a vacuum. There are historical factors that come into play in the form of institutional arrangements, resource allocations, and so on. And then there is the current landscape in terms of infrastructure, ownership, access, legislative mandates, and industrial actors and their ties to each other and to external actors. All of these historical and current strands need to be woven into a set of desired policy outcomes in terms of governance, the degree of dependence versus self-reliance, the necessary industrial development to achieve these goals, and the associated measures to assure the necessary human capital and investments. An important consideration as this policy work is done is not to fall into the trap of what I call cargo cult policymaking. During the Second World War, the American military built air bases on some Melanesian islands in the southwestern Pacific to support their war effort in the Pacific theater. During this time, many cargo planes landed on these small islands, and the islanders came into contact with Western goods. When the war ended, these air bases were disbanded and the cargo planes stopped coming. The islanders then built ritual structures out of wood mimicking aeroplanes and airport runways and air traffic control towers in the hope of attracting real aeroplanes to land on these islands and to bring cargo once again. Of course, the cargo planes never came. A similar phenomenon can happen with space policy, where a policy contains some policy statements that are sort of ritual structures with no real substance in the hope of attracting domestic or foreign investment or partnerships that will never come because the underlying conditions just aren't there. Later on, I will mention some of the elements of a sustainable space ecosystem that I think are important to avoid this kind of pitfall in space policy making. The fourth and last general remark I want to make is about not confusing policy with vision. Policy is not a vision. It's kind of map to reach a vision. But some explorers decide where they want to go without waiting for anybody else to give them a map. This slide shows the typical illustration you might find on the cover of an innovation policy document. It looks kind of techy and symbolizes a lot of activity, but doesn't actually inspire any new ideas. Policy is a map to guide us as we navigate from the status quo to some desired future state, normally developed and articulated as a result of a coalition of interests and priorities. Vision looks beyond policy and takes us to the next level. That needs imagination, one of humanity's greatest strengths. Here's a painting done by the famous visionary space artist Chesley Bonestell in 1948. It shows a vertically landing, reusable rocket on the moon with humans coming out of it. This painting was done nearly 10 years before the launch of the first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, and 20 years before the first human landing on the moon in 1969. Here, on the right, is a picture of SpaceX's Starship SN-15 prototype, taken in May 2021, shortly before its successful 10-kilometer test flight. Starship is designed to be a reusable rocket that might one day carry humans to the moon. One of the fascinating developments of the new space age is the emergence of the billionaire space investors who have different and even diverging visions for space. And they have the resources to realize their visions, and they're not sitting around waiting for anybody to draft a policy for space exploration. This creates opportunity, and it also raises governance concerns, because many of these developments are happening way faster than the regulatory capacity of governments to keep up. I cannot overstress the importance of avoiding divergent or fragmentary governance of space activities. And these opportunities and challenges are touching Africa as well. African companies are in the supply chains for international commercial space companies, which is a testament to the capabilities of these African companies. African governments are also facing challenges with a greater pace and volume of space activities. For example, in September last year, the government of Rwanda submitted a filing to the International Telecommunication Union, which proposed 2 constellations with a combined total of over 300,000 satellites. National space regulators are usually rather small offices, even in large spacefaring countries. African regulators will have to find ways to build national capacities for the regulation of their national space activities and ways to implement their Article 6 obligations under the 1967 Outer Space Treaty for the ongoing supervision of the national space activities of non-state entities under their jurisdiction and control. So, how does one harness the opportunities and manage the challenges to set up a sustainable space ecosystem in a country? This slide shows some of the elements of a sustainable space ecosystem. It goes without saying that political support at a national and regional level is key, because this support is what gives the impulse for a national space policy and the development of a supportive regulatory system. This policy and regulatory framework must be developed with government, private sector, and academia. The policy will also have an industrial development component that addresses the identified balance between autonomy and dependence on space technologies and space-derived information and services. It also sets the tone for what the private sector can expect from government in the form of supporting contracts and legislation. This support comes in the form of opportunities for industrial participation in space activities defined by government, which creates industrial capabilities that can then be commercially exploited with other partners. The marriage of capabilities with opportunities is what attracts both financial capital and human capital. Developing and retaining human capital in the space sector is a huge challenge, and this translates into the need for a steady stream of opportunities. Fortunately, a growing number of opportunities are being generated by the private sector, fueled by growing interest in the space sector from venture capital funds and institutional investors. The academic sector and state-funded research and development organizations play a critical role in supporting human capital development, as well as industrial development through academic R&D and government-funded research labs. Thus, investment in academic R&D infrastructure is a way of indirectly supporting industry, especially if industry can access facilities that would otherwise be too expensive or too infrequently used for a private company to justify establishing such facilities for their own internal use. A final element is that of strategic partnerships, both at state-to-state level and also among commercial actors. There is a rich history of states working hand in glove with their national commercial space actors, and I think this is one of the lessons that African countries can take from other more established space nations. One of the entry barriers that any company faces when trying to enter the international market is how much heritage they can demonstrate, specifically operational flight time in orbit. This is where states can play a huge role by being anchor customers for new startups to help them build this heritage that makes their products more marketable. Another way to do this is for states to demonstrate their commitment to their companies over the long term, either by engaging in long-term contracts or supporting them to establish partnerships or contracts with other established commercial entities. Space systems have long life cycles, and a customer considering various commercial product offerings is more likely to select a supplier they believe will probably still be around in the next 5 to 10 years. This is more likely to happen when a company has strong, long-term relationships with other established companies or governments. I want to step back now for a moment to take a more continental perspective. Now, we all know that the African Union has adopted an African space policy and strategy, and that the African Space Agency is in the process of being developed. This regional cooperation is important, but I believe it must be supported by foundational capabilities at the national level that can then be combined in a synergistic way on the continental level. So, while these continental structures are being developed, I think it's important to develop national capabilities and capacities, because these are what will ultimately determine the success of the continental initiative. If you have any doubts about this, just consider that the biggest contributors to the European Space Agency all have strong national space competencies, and those were precursors to the establishment of that agency in 1975. Indeed, the geographical return principle for funding ESA is premised on the existence of strong national industrial capabilities. In a similar vein, I would suggest that African countries need to see development of their own national space industries as one of the ways of supporting the new African Space Agency. So, what are the top 3 things I think should be done by African governments to capitalize on space for sustainable development and economic growth? The first is to support capacity building in government, in industry, and in academia. Capacity building in government would cover space policy making, space regulation, the governance and supervision of space activities. Governments can also support capacity building in industry and academia in a synergistic fashion by targeted support of these sectors in a way that encourages academic industry interactions to access such support. This could include supporting internships and scholarships that encourage collaboration between industry and academic institutions, and enhancing research and testing facilities in universities and research labs that are made available to industry to use when necessary. This will create opportunities in Africa and help to stem the brain drain of Africa's young space professionals to other parts of the world. The second would be to adopt an all-of-government approach to space that integrates domestic space capabilities into national development plans. And here, I don't just mean ritual policy statements on the societal benefits of space, but a real commitment to harnessing those benefits that translates to budgetary action by government and programmatic action by the private sector. The connection of space to the SDGs is clear. The challenge to governments and industry is to translate policy into action. The third major area is to develop an enabling regulatory framework for space activities that creates certainty for commercial actors and investors. That is not the same as having lower barriers for authorization, which encourages regulation shopping that may bring short-term benefits but at long-term cost to the space environment and ultimately to all space actors. Rather, the idea is to develop regulation that encourages responsible investment in space activities. These are a few things that can be done to address the theme of this conference, making Africa a new hotspot for space business. In closing, I want to take this opportunity to bring to your attention the Summit for Space Sustainability that Secure World Foundation and the UK Space Agency will co-host in London on the 22nd and 23rd of June this year. This will be a gathering of leaders from government, industry, and civil society to discuss solutions to the challenges of space sustainability and governance that I mentioned earlier. We would welcome participants from Africa to attend this event. I thank you for your attention, and I wish you all fruitful deliberations in this conference. Thank you very much.